Hello, everyone. My name's Vanessa Vallely, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live with the wonderful Helen Pankhurst. Now, we're having problems with Helen's camera, so we might have to just work through it and just use her voice for the moment. So before I begin, firstly, Helen, thank you for joining us.
Real pleasure. Thanks for being here with us.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Helen. For those of you who don't know, you should know. So Helen Pankhurst CBE is a British women's rights activist, scholar and writer. She is currently Care International Senior Advisor working in the UK and Ethiopia. She is the great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst and granddaughter of Sylvia Pankhurst, who were both leaders in the suffragette movement. So it's awesome background, which we're going to find out all more about. She has worked for a range of international development organisations, including Accord, Womankind Worldwide, and Care International, primarily in Ethiopia. Her focus has been on programme and policy in urban and rural development, water hygiene and sanitation, and women's rights. Helen has been a trustee of WaterAid, Farm Africa, and ActionAid, and has been a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics and visiting professor of the Manchester Metropolitan University. In 2018, Helen convened the Centenary Action Group, a cross-party coalition of over 100 activists, politicians and women's rights organisations campaigning to end barriers to women's political participation. CAG has also campaigned on issues ranging from increased transparency in political party candidate selections and the end of violence and abuse against women and girls. Helen sits on the steering committee of GM for Women 2028, a charity creating change for the women of Manchester. In 2012, the summer opening Olympics, Helen appeared alongside her daughter Laura. The pair have since formed a group called the Olympic Suffragettes, which campaigns on a number of women's rights issues. And that, believe it or not, is where Helen and I first met. So a little bit of giving away here. I was in my Pearly Queen adornment, representing London's history at the opening ceremony. And there was Helen being thrust up into the air. Was it you or Laura that was being thrust up into the air? I don't know if we've lost Helen or Helen's on mute.
I'm here. Yeah, it was one of the Olympics.
I mean, was it you or Laura that was being that reenactment?
It wasn't either of us. We were carrying the banners, actually, but there was a set of the suffragettes that were chosen to be Emily Wilding Davison. They were the one that were on the shoulders of other women, symbolically very important.
Yes, and that's where we first met. So roll on 11 years later, and you can't kind of get rid of me.
A joy.
So tell me, obviously I know the history, it's my business to know the history, but for those joining that, you know, haven't gone back and learnt about the suffragette movement, tell us a little bit about your family's history.
So my family, the Pankhursts, are synonymous with the suffragette movement because they founded it. Emmeline, together with her daughters, Christabel, the oldest, Sylvia, the middle, and Adela, the youngest daughter. There was also a son, and unfortunately, he died quite young, so you don't hear much about him. There was also a husband, Richard Pankhurst, Emmeline's husband, but he also died. But he died kind of influencing Emmeline to become involved in women's rights issues. So the story becomes one of a family of women leading the suffragette movement, namely the part of the suffrage campaign demanding the voice rather than just asking for it. So they ramp up the militancy and the demands for change. This was in 1903, after 50 years or more of campaigning through constitutional methods to get women the vote, which was not very effective. So the interesting thing, I suppose, is that I come with this surname, and I mean, one question I often put to people is how many of you have the same surname as your great-grandmother? And the fact that surnames are not passed on from generation to generation by women, they are passed on by men, is a statement about history and memory, and what gets counted and what gets valued. So my surname has remained mine for a number of reasons, but one is active choice.
Yeah, excellent. So it's such a fascinating history, isn't it? So 2018, and I remember it well, marked 100 years since women were first given the right to vote in Britain and in parliamentary elections. And this was the year that you formed the Centenary Action Group. Tell me a little bit more about that particular group and what it does.
So I feel really passionately about the Centenary Action Group because it does link to that memory, that history. It was formed in 2018, which was the centenary of when some women got the vote, and it will continue to operate till 2028, which will be the centenary of equal franchise. So it's got 10 years, and we are now bang in the middle of that 10-year period. And what we are trying to do in this 10 years is shift the needle on representation in Parliament. We have probably 2 elections, the elections coming up now and then one more before 2028. And the question is, what on our watch, and that's all of you listening to this as well, can we do to get to equal representation? Because otherwise you keep waiting for the next generation to get there. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm fed up with the rate of pace of change. And I think that with concerted work, with citizens who want to engage in politics, with the political establishment, so that it prioritizes and understands the constraints to women, understands that women are more likely to leave Parliament because of the poor systems within the structures of Parliament, and also because of abuse externally. So really address the constraints as to why not only women don't come through the pipeline, don't get selected, but also drop off sooner. So Centenary Action Group is addressing that whole space around the politics to get better representation, diversity of representation, but also a focus on equality. And what we want to achieve is that by 2028, we have equal numbers of women in Parliament. And that is in all the parliaments, but it happens to be that Westminster is the worst in terms of representation. With right now, it's 35% of women represented in Parliament in terms of MPs.
So who's part of that coalition? It's Fawcett Society. Who else forms the coalition itself?
So any organisation's welcome to join. Please do look at the Centenary Action Group website. And we're very actively cross-party. And one of the stories from a personal point of view behind that is that Emmeline ended up being a Conservative candidate, and Sylvia was very much a socialist from birth to death. So I feel that within my family, I have these different strands of political opinions. And I think that the whole of Parliament is so in the silos of party politics that it is quite useful to think of cross-party initiatives. And when it comes to feminism in particular, it's really important to do so, to address the whole man-made structure of Parliament through this cross-party approach. So it has organisations such as Women to Win, which is a Conservative organisation supporting women in politics, and Labour Women, and the Joe Cox Foundation, and Liberal women's organisations, and Green Party, etc. So part of the membership are those already very politically engaged. But a lot of them are also organisations such as the Fawcett, such as the WIs, the Seroptimists, Girl Guiding, Muslim Women's Network UK, many different types of organisations that are involved in feminist spaces, and researchers or individuals who are also interested in doing that.
And it is a wonderful, we're part of it. When I get along to a meeting, it's a room full of incredible women's organisations that are all fighting for societal change around women's human rights and stuff like that. So Helen, hats off to you for creating that. And again, if any of you have women's organisations that want to be part of CAG, do and go and have a look at the website. And we'll talk a little bit more CAG later.
Yeah.
So looking at kind of women in politics, and obviously it's obvious reasons why we need them there. We need that voice in the room. We need them to influence policy. Looking at kind of closer to home in terms of workplaces and things like that. So there's been lots of talk around, obviously, pay gap regulations that came in, people reporting their pay gap. And it's very interesting on International Women's Day. If any of you are followers of Twitter, there is actually a pay gap bot that for every firm that promotes International Women's Day and goes and shouts about its successes and things like that, the pay gap bot will call out that particular company's pay gap. So this is all to do with like performative kind of stuff around International Women's Day, but that's a whole conversation. But yeah, do not know that tomorrow. But just talking about pay gap, I mean, what more needs to be done to close that gender pay gap? Because it seems like we just talk about this stuff. And obviously I work with a number of firms that are doing great stuff, but we're just not getting there. Yeah. What do you think the key things are?
So, by the way, I really love that bot. I think it's brilliant.
It's brilliant.
Really, really good. I was at a company yesterday, and the figures were something like 12% difference in median and 23 in their mean. And they were talking about, it's reduced by 3% and so on and so forth. And you're kind of thinking, yes, and a lot of the companies are trying a little bit, and a lot of the bonuses tend to be a bit more sensitive to focusing on women. And now and again, they can say 1%, 2%, 3% increases. But as you said, we still don't seem to be getting very far very fast. I wondered whether, in addition to the pay gap reporting, there should be a statement about by when the companies aim to get to 50-50, because that would force a thinking about getting there in a way that I think that companies are just getting away with saying, well, these are our figures and we're a little bit happier because we did a tiny bit better than last year. Whereas if they had to say, actually, it'll take us 20 years to get there, or 10 years, or 5 years, it would create, I think, greater momentum around pushing for that change, because I think everybody would be saying, really? Is that the best we can do?
Well,
I wonder whether there is such a thing.
A few firms did do that a couple of years ago. They came out and said, we will be 50-50 by this particular time and stuff like that. And there was a huge furore over those firms that put out some pretty bold statements, because that's not easy to achieve in an organisation that's got 60, 70,000 kind of employees. And they've all failed. Unless there's one that I'm missing, please do correct me on LinkedIn if anyone actually hit that 50-50. I should know. But so I think, I totally agree with you. Put your stake in the ground and actually work to achieve it, and maybe not make it such a shock. This is the year we're going to do it, right? Because these things obviously take time. And that's the frustrating point, isn't it? That these things take time.
Yeah. So, and I mean, maybe, I hear you about the pragmatism of the reality is when they claim that they're going to do it in 5 years, it never happens. But then that should be tabled. We should table the fact that the rate of change is so slow that people are embarrassed if they have to think forward about what that means in terms of when equality would be achieved. Therefore, what? Therefore, what do we do?
Absolutely. So it's that follow-on action, isn't it? It's not like we haven't hit it and that's that. So moving on from kind of pay gap, another disparity. I mean, obviously we've seen the work of the Hampton-Alexander report last week, which, that percentage number of women on boards has massively increased since 2008, I think, where it was like 9%. Because again, the percentage eludes me. Someone could probably put it in the chat. I think it's 34%. It might be higher. But, we've made great progress there. But we still have an issue around women in our boardroom and women in leadership positions. What more do you think could be done there? I mean, this is not just business. This is government. This is academia.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were speaking yesterday, I was at City Hall, and Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, was hosting a feminist policy forum. And I think it's quite interesting that he, and I know you want to ask about male allies down the line, but, as a politician in the public space, he is so clear that his identity is as a feminist. He will bring it up. He will talk about it. There are a lot of deeds that follow from that statement, that visible identity of his. And I know that in City Hall and with some of the policies in London, there's been really interesting work in this area. So, for example, they had what was it? The Our Time initiative to address the lack of women in leadership roles, breaking down the cultural and social barriers that prevent women from achieving their full potential, and supporting access to the networks, contacts, and opportunities often needed to progress in leadership roles. Vanessa, I think some of the work that you do in this space is phenomenal. It is about networks. It is about contacts. It is about mentoring, supporting, valuing, showing, putting the spotlight on women in ways that I think are the spice of this all. This achieves phenomenal change.
Yeah. And on, I mean, Sadiq Khan, everyone's going to have an opinion on him. I mean, he was a big supporter of us at Gender Networks. He hosted a meeting there, and you're quite right. He's made it very, very clear that, he is a feminist. And I love the way that you brought in the word deeds. So deeds, not words, which is obviously, very, very close to your heart in terms of we want more action rather than kind of, just all of this talk. So talking about kind of women on boards, talking about women in leadership positions, there is, I say, progress that has been made, but as I kind of say in a lot of my groups, but if all the women kind of look like me, we're not making progress, right? It is about making sure that all women from all different backgrounds get a seat at the table. So how do we empower and uplift, open up doors of opportunity from women that come from underrepresented communities? So women of colour, LGBTQ women, women with disabilities, women from different social backgrounds. What can we do? What can we do there?
I think by thinking about intersectionality all the time, it's not an add-on, it's not a by the side, it's not a, do the main work and then have a woman who's a disabled woman or whatever. So I think it's centering different marginalized voices in everything that is being done. And I know that's a principle. And if that's a principle, then it can carry through, and you might not achieve it all the time, but hopefully it's a better starting point. I think there are also ways that one can campaign to address the practical barriers. And I'm thinking here, for example, that in Parliament there was a fund, I think it was called the Enabled Fund, to support candidates in politics who were disabled with some of the additional costs that are required. And it was set up, it was operational for a bit, and now it's stopped. And I think, and we are campaigning, Centenary Action Group are campaigning for that fund to be reinstituted. And I think just lots of ways in which looking at the practical barriers to women, what time, where the meetings, what are the support requirements, those kind of approaches can go a long way, rather than just keeping it at a higher level and then ignoring some of the reasons why you don't have the right voices around the table.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with that. You're not just having one lens on women. There's multiple different ways that we kind of show up, and that's what this whole theme for International Women's Day is really about, isn't it? It's that shift from equality to equity, because we won't get the equality without the equity piece, and fairness for all, so that we all get a bite at achieving what it is that we've kind of set out to achieve, and having those different voices around the room.
Yeah, 100%. And then how we always, when we've got our feminist hats on, we're always saying, unless women are at the table, then the quality of the decisions is that much weaker. Well, exactly the same needs to be said about diversity within any group of women.
Yeah, 100%. So earlier on we touched on it when we were talking about Sadiq and male allies. Men have a huge role to play, don't they, in the fight for gender equality? How do we work with them to engage them in that conversation? And I would caveat here, obviously in my world, I hang out with lots of kind of male allies, male ambassadors, he for she's, call them what you will. I'm very lucky to work in that space where I see that firsthand, but that isn't necessarily the case everywhere. So what more can we do, Helen, to get that conversation with the men who often hold positions of power to really drive this equity conversation forward?
It's critical that we do this, because otherwise it's just women talking to women, and we're not shifting things, we're not shifting the needle. So I think it's finding lots of different ways of doing it in different fora, encouraging men to feel comfortable, and making sure that we don't perpetuate some of that by creating the talk about banter is interesting in this regard, because we know now, in terms of male violence against women, that this banter issue, which has been accepted for a while, cannot be accepted, because it leads to all sorts of things which are way beyond just the jokes. Now, it's a silly comparison to make at a certain level, but I do think that it's very easy when you're in certain groups to dismiss the other and to make fun of the other. And as marginalized voices, women often do exactly the same about men. So on women's only spaces, we make fun of the men. When there's one man who's there, who's looking after the kids when it's time to collect the children at the end of school. And thank goodness that's changing. It's not just one man who's collecting their kids, but that kind of sense of responsibility that we all have not to make fun of men when they are in female spaces, I think is really important, to make sure that there are more men involved in those spaces, so that when men come, they come with other men, so that when women go to talk about and campaign for gender issues, they come with their brothers, husbands, partners, fathers. There's so many ways in which bringing men into women's spaces could transform things. I also think that there's just like with the issue of color, where it's very clear that it's women that need to, with the issue of color, where it's very clear that it's white people that need to do the work. Yes. In terms of addressing racism, men need to do the work in terms of being not just allies, but active allies, understanding how their privilege is part of the problem, not just for women, but for men, for young men, because of a million issues that we could discuss around mental health, around ideas about what relationships are all about, etc., etc.
So it's interesting when you say from that position of privilege, I think, and to your point, 100%, it's us that needs to do the work around kind of, educating ourselves to understand the lived experience of others. So 100% with you on that one. So, I mean, I see it on Gender Networks, which obviously is our forum for the women's network leaders. Definitely more men becoming engaged in those conversations, more men as chairs. But again, there's probably a reason why they've kind of joined those groups. They're passionate about it, perhaps they identify as feminists. But my concern is that we get to the people that are not in those rooms, the naysayers and the people that the gentlemen that hold the position of power, where perhaps from a generational reason, they don't quite get this stuff yet. So I think that's probably where we need to do some work as well. Moving on to gender-based violence and sexual assault and harassment, domestic violence against women and girls. We're just, and Helen, I'm sure everyone will agree with me, every other week there just seems to be another headline, of women getting murdered, women getting abused. I mean, it's constant. When we talk about eradication of domestic violence against women and girls, where do we even start with that, Helen?
Yeah,
I know.
Big question. And it's not getting better. I wrote this book for 2018, and I asked at the end of each chapter, so the book is called Deeds Not Words, the story of women's rights then and now. At the end of each chapter, I asked people to score between 0 and 5 what they thought about that particular issue. So politics, economics, culture, and violence was one of the chapters. And in the talks that I give, I ask people to rate and to put their fingers up to show whether they think it's a 0, no change, or a 5, equality. And I've been a little bit tracking what people answer over the years. And the answer that they give on violence is decreasing over the years. It is not increasing. I mean, even in the last 5 years, our sense of violence as a problem has increased, not decreased. So more work needs to be done. More work needs to be done with the systems of power, the police, the establishments, those that can call accountability, the criminal justice system. That means that the rape review, the rape figures, all of that. I could go on in terms of the problems, but I think it's the structures of power and policing and people that are in those positions need to be held accountable much more so. And we just need to keep on drumming the drums and demanding more, demanding better. But it is incredibly depressing.
Yeah. Anybody in the CAG kind of leading the charge? I mean, obviously you've got the refugees organisations and people like that. Is there anything that you've seen, like from the CAG group perspectives, that are really kind of pushing government on any of that?
Well, we're focusing primarily on women in politics and parliament, and therefore we have focused on the online harms bill with awareness raising around that and the experience of politicians in terms of the violence that they experience. So that's the lens through which we're campaigning, rather than violence more generally in the society. And I think that's what's needed in different spaces. I think different campaigns are needed to push for the change there.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously you work for Care International, and you've done huge work, obviously, not just in the UK, but abroad as well. Now, women's access to healthcare, I mean, as much as we've got our healthcare system, there's still massive inadequacies in how women's health is in the UK, let alone kind of across the world. What can we do, or what more needs to be done to make sure that every single woman has access to quality healthcare, like reproductive healthcare, regardless of their economic status or geographic location?
We need to keep banging on about it. I think that's the big issue. I'm reminded of my grandmother, so Sylvia Pankhurst, when she had my father in 1927, almost died, and so did my father in childbirth. And so 3 years later, typical Sylvia, she doesn't just have the baby. 3 years later, she publishes a book called Save the Mothers. And it's on the title, it says, a plea for measures to prevent the annual loss of about 3,000 childbearing mothers and 20,000 infant lives in England and Wales, and a similar grievous wastage in other countries. And she shows a lot of data. She ensures campaigning on the issues. And this is 1930, well before the start of the NHS in 1948, I think it is. So I guess my statement would be that it's such a basic importance to the world, to the humanity, and to women in particular, because of our role in childbearing, both biologically and socially, to prioritize this. I would argue that if we had equal representation in Parliament, issues such as health and childcare would be given greater priority, wouldn't be as expensive in terms of childcare, and would be better provided for in terms of the whole social care issue than it is now. That the politics that we have and the reality of the weaknesses in our social system are interrelated. And one of the solutions is better representation in Parliament. And then the other solution is to continue to campaign and demand better as citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if we've lost Helen's sound. Helen, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, wonderful. It's okay. I can see the sound. My sound bar's going off. So, I mean, we've covered so much in this session around kind of women in politics, marginalised women, male allyship, women's healthcare. Childcare is another big one. I mean, I watched the work of the fantastic Jolie over at Pregnant and Screwed, who, will not get off the government's back for what's right in terms of childcare, because it is keeping millions and millions of women out of the workplace, because we just don't have the support we need in terms of the ever increasing cost of childcare. Any thoughts on that before we move on?
Just that it's so important. And 1970s, the women's liberation movement, it's quite interesting to go back over time and look at what people prioritize. They were asking then in the 1970s for 24-hour childcare. And you think about how poor childcare is now, 1923. 1970s, that was their demand. I mean, now who would even dream of asking for that? All we're asking for is a bit less expensive and consistent and systematic childcare for everybody, not just year 2 and then not year 3 or not year 4, and just bits and pieces. So just a consistent, systematic childcare for all adults and looking after all children. I don't know. I despair on that one as well.
Just before we move on from that, what is the big issue in government in terms of, obviously we know there's no magical money tree, right? But there seems to be for other things. So why can't they support getting more women back into work through affordable childcare?
These are false economies. The lack of attention to social care is a false economy. The investment in caring and in education delivers and delivers and delivers again. And yet you have a system, a political system that doesn't prioritize it, that's just it's articulated in a different way, and therefore priorities go in a different direction. I mean, we saw that with COVID, when some of the decisions about what was prioritized and what was not prioritized. So
Yeah.
social care as something that women really understand and are focused on is never given the priority that it needs. And if it did, it would yield economic benefits.
100%. I think, there's figures that say on Pregnant and Screwed how much it would add to the economy.
Yeah.
If they just prioritise it, they just seem to deprioritise anything that's to do with women, but I'll get off my soapbox about that one. So before I move on to some recent activities of yours, what can we do to try and dismantle the patriarchy and other systems that continue to perpetuate gender inequality?
I think by all caring, by all knowing that it's not somebody else's responsibility, it's our responsibility, by operating in different spheres. So in our own personal ones, domestically, with our friends, with our colleagues at work, with the way that we vote, and also stand in Parliament.
Right. Okay. Yes, absolutely. Vote. We have that conversation a lot. So just in terms of your own, obviously you're very, very busy woman this week. So thank you so much for spending this time with me. You recently recorded a podcast, didn't you, for Care International with the wonderful Sophie Ellis-Bextor. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so please, everybody, it's called #March and then the number 4 women. And you can find the podcast anywhere that you normally get your podcasts from. Or if you go to Care International or Stylist Magazine, if you want to walk as you are listening to the podcast and record any pledges of the kilometers that you're walking, we stylists are adding all of those up so that we have this idea of walking around the globe together. So it's another kind of way in which we're linking up. But the podcast itself is a global story in that we interview 5 women from around the world. And the theme is women who lead in crisis. So we've got a woman from Ukraine, Poland, from Yemen, from Turkey, Somalia, and Bangladesh, each talking about the crises that they face, be it the earthquake, be it war, be it famine, be it climate change, and how not just about the story of the problem, which we need to hear, we need to be global citizens and understand these humanitarian crises, but also this is a day of celebration. And part of the celebration is by really looking at how women are making a difference. So the women that we interview are just amazing in terms of the things that they have done to make a difference, to lead in crisis. And for me, one of the most touching elements is also when they talk about what their aspirations are or their hopes are for women more generally. So we say, what is your statement? What do you want to say to women globally? And they come up with the most amazing statements of kind of joy and empowering of women and recommendations to them. And then these 5 stories are punctuated with songs from Beverly Knight, Ray, Imelda May, the Bond Quartet, and Urban Voices. So some amazing singing in between, and then some statements of support from very well-known allies, female and male, Paloma Faith, David Tennant, just a lot of different people, Lem Seaside, many people's voices also in support. And it's a joyful 1 hour or so. So please do listen, share, and do support Care International, because we're also spotlighting these humanitarian crises which are around in the world and which we need to do something about.
Yep. So you can find that link to that on the Centenary Action Group. It's a great episode. And as Helen said, lots of different episodes there as well. And do download that playlist as well. And let's all walk in solidarity. I think that's more of a movement, Helen. I love that. And actually, talking to Beverly Knight, they've brought back, so 4 years ago, was it, that they brought out a theatre production around suffragettes, and they brought it back. And Beverly Knight is actually playing the lead role in that, isn't she?
Kind of. It's interesting, actually. So it's a musical called Sylvia, and it's pop funk musical about the suffragette movement. And Beverly plays Emmeline, so she plays my great-grandmother. But the musical is actually more seen from Sylvia, so from my grandmother's point of view. So Beverly plays the matriarch, but it's actually more about Sylvia and, in fact, the schisms in the family between Emmeline and Sylvia. But it is a lovely performance. It's only on till the 1st of April. So if any of you have not seen it, please do go. You'll absolutely love it. And it's getting standing ovations all the time.
It is. It's like a more Hamilton kind of style.
That's right.
And I think it's on till it's down at the Old Vic. Actually, on my LinkedIn post earlier on, I've put all different links on there for things that we've mentioned, such as the podcast, such as CAG as well. Now, one of the things to say is that, you know, Centenary Action Group, all of the charities and the women's rights groups there, no one gets any funding from the government, right? If they can't pay for childcare, they're not going to pay for charities to right their wrongs. So obviously CAG are very much rely on the good nature and generosity of people like us and other organisations. So Helen, I mean, obviously everyone watching this, I'm sure they've had a wonderful time, but it would be great if we donated to your work as well. So, and I know economic times, you know, short of money and stuff like that, but like, tell us a little bit where that pot of money goes in and kind of what it will enable you to do.
So, yeah, if you can support financially the Centenary Action Group, it's a great cause because it's a cause in our future. It's a cause that can push towards better representation in Parliament. And we've seen and I've just been arguing about the link between that and all sorts of policy changes that will affect maternity issues, health issues, caring issues, etc. We need better representation, more women in Parliament in order to have all the other changes that can deliver better. It's a small group, Centenary Action Group. We don't have many costs, but we do need some money to staff the work that we do and to run the campaign. So, for example, at the moment, we have a campaign called Women Counts. If you go to the, Women Count, if you go to the website, you'll see more about it. And what we are doing is we're mapping where women are being selected to run for Parliament in order to shine the spotlight on where there've never been women being selected. It's a bit like the equal pay gap reporting, where that forcing of the reporting is forcing accountability. We feel that the map showing where women have stood and are not standing ever in certain constituencies will be really useful. And also we're doing kind of qualitative ways of highlighting women from different backgrounds and their stories of standing as candidates. So that's the kind of campaign that we want to be able to run over time. And we are only going to be working till 2028. So this is a critical moment, these two elections. Ideally, a small regular donation in that period would be really, really useful to enable us to maximise what we can do.
Absolutely. So if you can support in any way, I've seen firsthand the work of the Centenary Action Group and what Helen does, you know, bit by bit, as slow as the progress may be, you know, we can hopefully make the changes in society that we most need. So, Helen, I'm going to finish on one final question. What message would you send to women that are watching this, male allies, you know, young girls who are looking up to you, you know, as somebody that leads the way in the space of gender equity? You know, what are your parting words to all of them?
My parting words are that you are the difference. It's the more you engage with the world, the more the world will give back. And it's not a question of just looking up to others. It's thinking, what can you do? And then I think also I have a motto. My motto is fun and purpose. So it's about, you know, do things, but do them with joy, care, but also look after yourself.
Yeah, 100%. Helen, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. And again, I know your week is absolutely squashed. So thank you so much. There were so many nuggets of wisdom there that I know everyone will kind of take away and ponder on. It just leaves me to say, I wish you a wonderful International Women's Day. And thank you for your family's history, which has led the way for so many of us. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks for everything that you do. Thank you.
To donate to the CAG before I go. I'll put the link in the chat again. Thank you so much. Happy International Women's Day, everyone.
Bye.